Congratulations, Westlake. We have finally made it to the greatest unit in all of APUS history. Maybe the greatest thing to ever happen in all of history. It's the American Revolution. You love it, I love it. It's the greatest thing to probably ever happen. I got my red, got my white, got my blue, got my American flag in the background, got George Washington spinning the block, I got Daryl, I got a build of the day, I got my England sweatshirt, I got everything. I'm stacked, I'm hyped. This is like the best thing to ever happen. One of the 3 peaks of history, and as always, we got the filled out learning targets thanks to Connor Kramer in the description. It's a real link this time, don't worry about that. Also got a full length practice test down there again for you guys. But without further ado, let's dive right into this without any more dilly dallying. God bless our troops, God bless America, and gentlemen, let's learn Unit 3 of APUS. Alright, let's start this off with one of the most hyped terms in this entire unit. We got the Ohio River Valley. Pretty amazing. Why was this area desirable, you might ask? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. The region was super fertile, and you needed it to expand westward. That was like the gateway to go west, into the Great Plains, into the West Coast. And both the French and the British wanted it really bad, and they started a war over it because they both wanted it. And that leads us to our good and glorious King George Washington and the French and Indian War. Washington was like a young colonel in this war, and he just like fought some battles, and he actually got his butt kicked pretty bad in some of them. But it turned him into the man that he became for the American Revolution. So it's like a character building arc. But basically the French and the British fought a war over the Ohio River Valley. That's what you need to know. The Peace of Paris, The Peace of Paris in 1783. This was the end of the 7 Years' War, which was a big war in Europe. Well, it was actually a world war. It was basically World War I. But it's not called that for some reason. But it is World War I, 7 Years' War. Great Britain and Prussia versus France, Russia, and Austria. Great Britain and Prussia win in a surprise. No one thought they were going to win. They were like getting cooked the whole time, but they came back. And then Great Britain took all of Canada because they won. And then so Britain basically owned most of North America except the Spanish had some stuff in the bottom. But that doesn't matter that much. So all that you need to know is that the British are dominant in North America. Next up, we got Pontiac's Rebellion. Okay, so following the war, Pontiac, he was like this Native American chieftain or Ottawa, and he led this revolt against British people because he was like, their policies were too much burden. They were expanding into their territory, they were taxing them too much, they were destroying their way of life, and this guy Pontiac had enough of it. So he started an uprising against the British, and as always, it failed. The Proclamation of 1763. Okay, so this was the thing that King George came out with, and basically it was trying to like make peace with the Native Americans because things were a little tense. He forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, which if you don't know your geography is kind of like where West Virginia ends. And it was intended to prevent further conflicts between the Native Americans and the English. And anyway, we got the Paxton Boys, 1763. This group of Pennsylvania frontiersmen basically just was mad at the colonial government's inability to protect them from the Native Americans. It's kind of like Bacon's Rebellion, and so they took violent action against the natives, and they were like, we'll just do it ourselves. And so they went up and shot up some Native Americans, pretty lit. And then we got the Albany Plan of Union. Okay, this is actually important. This was Benjamin Franklin's brilliant idea to create the United States of America before the United States of America. The Albany Plan of Union was like, it was going to make like a unified government for the 13 colonies for defense against natives and other external threats. And he was like, hey guys, all 13 of us colonies should like work together. And everyone was like, huh, and then it never actually happened, but it was an idea. So they were low-key thinking about it, not independence, just like a unified system of government under the Kingdom of England so that they could defend themselves from external attacks more easily and more unified. Dang, bro, this one's short. Clap it up. You gotta freaking love the American Revolution when they give you learning targets that are this short. Okay, just chalk everything I just said. Chapter 5 is longer than Mrs. Cluck's rant about King Henry VIII. This John is long, but that's all good because it's all about the American Revolution, which means it's all quite lovely. Let's start off with the thing that was on Unit 4, Unit 2, the Navigation Acts. So this was just mercantilism. The British were just making sure that everything that was happening in the colonies worked to the benefit of the British. This meant enforcing smuggling, making sure that things weren't coming in from places other than Britain, and making sure things were coming out of places other than, like going out to places other than Britain. Making sure that you weren't selling stuff to like Spanish or Italians for a better price than what you were selling to the British. And there were some benefits of this. It guaranteed that the British Royal Navy would protect the merchant ships coming from the colonies back to Britain. But it was far outweighed by the liabilities, which were the or not the tax burden, but the economic burden of only being able to sell to the British at a poor price, whereas the Spanish and the Italians would give them a better price, but they weren't allowed to sell them according to the Navigation Acts. So they sort of started to smuggle it out and sell them to them in secret to get more money, but the British soon started to put down the hammer in a bunch of different ways that we're about to get into right here. It's the virtual representation. This was this brilliant idea from Parliament that even though they weren't represented, the British Parliament still represented everybody in the kingdom, including colonists, who did not have any active representation that they could elect. It was just stupid, but it was a thing. We got the writs of assistance. These were just search warrants given to redcoats and customs officers that allowed them to search any American ship coming in or coming out to check for smuggling to Spanish and Italians and check things that were coming in, making sure they were all from Britain. Once again, raising anti-British sentiment in the colonies and making the British more money. Another thing like this is the Sugar Act. This reduced the tax on molasses, which aimed to end smuggling. It's kind of weird how that works, but it works. But they also enforced stricter smuggling policies and were checking basically everything, and this made the colonists really mad because they used to be evading their taxes, and now the Great Britain was checking everything, so they had to start paying the taxes. Once again, British getting richer, colonists getting more mad. Stamp Act, which was like the Sugar Act on steroids. Anything that was paper, newspaper, stamp, pay a tax, paper, stamps, anything that was, you would pay a tax on it, and this drove the colonists nuts. And to be fair, it was kind of stupid, but it was just meant to make Great Britain a bunch of money because they were low-key brokies after the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. So they were trying to get all their money back, but the colonists were not big fans. So this, once again, raising anti-British sentiment while making the British more money. Oh, here we go, colonial reaction. So this is like where taxation without representation comes from. They were like, we should either be allowed to govern ourselves or we should have representation in the British Parliament, and Parliament was like, no. And in response to that, they created the Committee of Correspondence. This was like the colonial Congress, or the Continental Congress before the Continental Congress. They like established this unified thing. The Committee of Correspondence and the Stamp Act Congress are pretty similar things. It was like a unified effort to repel British taxes. Like they would smuggle things in together, they would start fighting information wars, and they would work together to circumvent British taxes. And the Stamp Act Congress specifically was targeted at the Stamp Act. They were like, guys, this is actually really crazy, and they said the right to consent to taxation is an essential freedom, and they started to boycott and protest British goods, and this led Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. And so that was a win for the colonists until they dropped the Declaratory Act a few hours later, but we aren't there yet. First, we have the non-importation agreements. This was all the colonists saying, we'll boycott British goods, basically. It tanked their economy, and it made the British kind of angry at them, but it was a sign of resistance to the overly taxative British. Next up, we got the Sons of Liberty, or the Daughters of Liberty, because College Board is inclusive now, I guess. The Sons of Liberty were like this activist organization who were super anti-British, anti the taxes. They weren't pro-independence yet. They get there, and they're one of the main factors in the start of the American Revolution. But right now, they're just spreading anti-British sentiment to try to repeal the taxes. Now, the Declaratory Act, this happened right after Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. They said, all right, we will repeal the Stamp Act, but we still have absolute authority in all cases whatsoever, meaning that Parliament got to decide on every piece of legislation that was happening in the colonies, which even further pushed tensions with the colonists. overboard. And we got regulators. These were just like guys from Carolina who were super mad at the corrupt government and high taxes, and so they kind of started a little mini rebellion until they were put down by British redcoats. So that was kind of sad. But all of these things here, the context in which you'll be asked questions about these is they will all be like reasons why the American Revolution happened. These are things that began the American Revolution. Things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act pushed the colonists to hate the British, to despise them for their taxation without representation. That is the key thing for these first few terms. Is it was super important in building anti-British sentiment among the colonies, which led to the American Revolution. So the things I said before were like low-key causes of the American Revolution, and these are like high-key causes of the American Revolution. All of these things are like directly correlated to the Declaration of Independence. So let's get into it. First off, we got the Townshend Acts. This was a new set of taxes on imported goods into the colonies, and once again made colonists mad and made the British rich. Then we got an absolute travesty, the Boston Massacre. Picture this in your head. A bunch of Bostonites frolicking through the square when a bunch of mean, angry Brits come up and start rat-ta-ta-ta, which is more or less what happened. But basically, the British were patrolling, and the Bostonites started to throw snowballs at them. The snowballs turned into ice balls. The ice balls turned into oyster shells, which are apparently very sharp. And in the chaos, the order was given to fire. And with that, 5 of the colonists were killed and many more injured. They were all scattered, and as soon as that happened, propaganda. Anti-British sentiment soared in the colonies. Everyone viewed them as tyrants, and everyone began to hate, not everyone, but this swayed a lot of people to start hating the British. This was a super pivotal thing that kind of caused the balance beam to kind of lean in favor of the Americans. Next up we got Paul Revere. This is my brother. The British, the British are coming. The British are coming. He was a part of the Sons of Liberty, and he was super important in going around and making everyone hate the British. That was his job. He would just go around and like gossip about the British, and so that's what he did. And he also did the ride at midnight, or whatever it's called, where he like went through and was like, the British are coming, which actually he didn't complete, and he got captured by the British halfway through. But it's still a cool thing. Followed by the Boston Tea Party. This was the colonists decided that Halloween came early, and they disguised themselves as a bunch of Native Americans and went onto a British merchant ship and threw 300 chests of tea into the harbor, which was kind of cool. This was in protest of the British Parliament giving the British East India Company a monopoly over tea in the colonies, meaning you could only buy it from one person, meaning the prices were quite expensive. The Intolerable Acts, which were intolerable, was the response of the British Tea Party, and this act closed Boston's port and restricted their town meetings, allowed soldiers to quarter in private homes, which, if you didn't know, is why we have the Third Amendment. If you know what the Third Amendment is off the top of your head, I applaud you. But basically, it says soldiers can't quarter in other people's homes, which seems kind of stupid like now, but back then, a redcoat would walk into Boston, get in a house and be like, this thing's pretty nice, and that would be his new house. So that was another part of the Intolerable Acts. It was just aimed to punish people in Massachusetts for being annoying, and it was direct threats to their political freedom. But the Quebec Acts just extended Quebec's boundary, not crazy. It went beyond the Ohio River, and it granted religious freedom to Catholics in Canada, and a bunch of the American colonists kind of got upset about this. Once again, making them more angry at the British. Okay, the Continental Congress. This was a convention of delegates from all of the different colonies to coordinate resistance against the Intolerable Acts and mobilize the colonial militia into one army. This is where Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. W saying, here we go. Now we got the good stuff. This is Lexington and Concord, a battle. The shots heard around the world. The way that it happened was British intelligence learned that American militia were storing a bunch of gunpowder and munitions at this place, in this town of Concord. And the British didn't like that, so they got about 600 soldiers and they started marching to Concord. And on the way to Concord, they passed through a town called Lexington. And there, the militia would not let them pass. And the British were like, get out of the way. We're going to go take your supplies. And the colonial militia were like, no. And so they stood there yelling at each other for a little bit until eventually someone shot. And this was the first shot, the first battle of the American Revolution, if we aren't counting the Boston Massacre. And surprisingly, the outnumbered colonial militia began to push the best army in the world backwards until the British decided it was time to retreat. But on their way back, more and more militia started to show up along the way, firing on the British as they retreated. And this was kind of a big embarrassing loss for the British because they just got outdone by a smaller colonial force of literal farmers. And this really raised colonial morale. They were like, hey, wait, we can beat these guys. They aren't all that. So yeah, Lexington and Concord was kind of the bomb. And that led to the formation of the Continental Army, which was established at the Second Continental Congress and was just pulled together all of colonial militias under the command of our glorious King George Washington, who was actually a subpar battlefield tactician, but it was under his command due to his experience in the French and Indian War, and he led all of their militia, but they were super undersupplied. The Continental Congress was like, we'll give you all this stuff, and they did not get any of this stuff. They were super undersupplied basically the entire war. Now we got Lord Dunmore's proclamation. This was a proclamation that offered freedom to any slave or indentured servant that ran away to the British and would fight in the war against the colonists. So this even further strained tensions between the colonists and the British, because all of their slaves and indentured servants began to run away and fight against them. And this was especially evident in the South, where they were pivotal to the economy and they started leaving en masse, and it was not good. And then we got Thomas Paine, the guy who made Common Sense, which was the most printed book in American history. I don't know if it still is, but it was just a thing. It was a book that advocated for American independence. This was like the first time independence was really like thrown around, the I word. Most people still wanted to be a part of the British Empire. They just wanted to repeal the taxes or get representation. Not Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was like, the British suck and we need to become our own country. The economics will be better. We'll be able to stay out of European conflicts, and a bunch of reasons that were very valid. And everyone was like, this makes sense. So very influential to the start of the American Revolution. And then we have Benjamin Franklin. He was an extremely important revolutionary leader, and he secured French support in the American Revolutionary War after John Paul Jones blew up some stuff in England and the battles of Saratoga and Trenton. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 is what led the French to join the American Revolutionary War, but that'll be later, I'm pretty sure. He's also on the $100 bill. So if you ever hear someone be like, hey, pass me a Benjamin, they're talking about a $100 bill. All right, let's move on to complaints against King George III. Basically everything. King George III and the colonized was the worst. Imposing taxes without consent, dissolving colonial legislature, quartering troops in homes, obstructing justice, maintaining a standing army without approval, encouraging Native American attacks. Straight tyranny, not good stuff. Everyone hated King George III. He was a bum city. And then Thomas Jefferson one day just woke up and dropped the Declaration of Independence, July 4th. Hoorah, rah, the beginning of the greatest nation ever. This is what happens when you give Europeans 250 years to build a nation from scratch. We're the bomb.com. But yeah, the Declaration of Independence declared the United States as an independent nation, separate from Great Britain, and then everyone was like, what the heck? Or everyone in Britain was like shocked. They couldn't believe it. War was on. They were coming to put down the insurrection. Unalienable rights. This was in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are like basic rights that the government can't take them away. Enlightenment ideas were also super heavily seen in the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of John Locke's philosophy that individuals have fundamental rights and that a government cannot take away those rights, and if the government tries to, the individuals should rise up and change the government. What's next? We got, it's fighting time. This is my favorite part. Love me a good underdog story. How far are we? Pretty far, but it's all good. We're going strong. Okay, British strengths. The British had a lot of strengths. Strongest army in the world. Napoleon wasn't around yet, so they were basically the best. Strongest navy in the world. Experienced military commanders from the 7-Year War. They had hired mercenaries like the Hessians, who were extremely experienced. They had every advantage going for them. Some weaknesses were misjudging the Americans' support for independence. They thought that it was only a small faction of people who wanted independence, and most people wanted to go back into the British crown. But after common sense dropped, public sentiment was way on the independence. They were kind of broke, so it was kind of hard to maintain a large army. They underestimated the capabilities of the colonial militia and its commanders. They also made strategic errors, and because they were stupid in the way that they fought the war, so that was a weakness. Now we got the American strengths. Deep devotion, straight up that dog for the independence. Some military experience from prior conflicts with Native Americans. The ability to draw in a large pool of volunteer militia rapidly. They were called Minutemen. They would just stand by waiting for the call to go, smoke some British pack. They fought on their own soil. They had the home field advantage, right? British had a 13-0 lead, gone. Colonists are fighting on their own ground. Native Americans couldn't win with the home field advantage. Americans, we can. We took the home field advantage to the max, and we fought on our own soil, and we took big dubs. Some American weaknesses were they were so poorly equipped. Some people didn't have food, others didn't have shoes, others didn't have guns, others didn't have gunpowder. It was a mess. Nobody had anything. But that's all good because we had the indomitable human spirit, and that's really all you need. They relied on local militias who would have to go home to harvest crops every now and then. Internal division over independence, challenges in maintaining enlistment. A lot of the soldiers were not very well trained. Role of African Americans in the conflict. This was they served in both American and British forces, but more British than American. There were 5,000 blacks enlisted in the Continental Army and state militias. They would gain freedom. After the British said, you would gain freedom if you fight for us, the colonies were like, oh, wait, we have to do that. Supply and demand type stuff. But yeah, you had black people fighting for the British and for the Americans. But more blacks joined the British because of Lord Dunmore's proclamation happened before. Okay, now we got the roles of Hessians in the conflict. Hessians were from this German microstate, and they were these fighter mercenaries for hire, and you could just hire them and they'd go fight your war. And so they were employed by the British to fight the Americans, and they got absolutely obliterated by George Washington crossing the Delaware River on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning or something, and then they smoked him at the Battle of Trenton. Hessians absolutely obliterated. So the role of Hessians in the conflict was just getting absolutely obliterated by George Washington and the boys. Just a little bit of cannon fodder, Next up, we got the Battle of Saratoga. Big W battle. Okay, so imagine a map of America in your head, of North America. There was a British army up in Canada, and there was a British army down here, and they were like, okay, let's split the colonies in half, like Civil War style. Let's split them in half, and then we can take one at a time, right? So the army from the top starts to move down, and the army in the bottom, commanded by William Howe, was like, no, let's not do that. And he went off and did his own thing. But this guy didn't know that, so he kept on going down, intending to meet William Howe, until Benedict Arnold, absolute lad, until he betrayed the Americans, but that's a different story. He takes an army, and he goes and he confronts them, and he absolutely bombs them, and the British get obliterated at the Battle of Saratoga. And that basically destroys the entire Northern Army, part of the British Army. And it was a crazy American victory. No one was expecting it. It showed that the British could be beat. It showed that the Americans were really fighting for, they were serious. They weren't messing around. This wasn't some little insurrection that they were going to put down in a year. No, they were ready to fight for independence. They weren't messing around. And this is the Battle of Saratoga, along with the Battle of Flamborough Head, which was John Paul Jones kicking British butt. This is what persuaded France to join the American Revolutionary War. So this is a super important battle because it brings France into the war. Reasons for French alliance with the Americans. because the Americans were showing that they could beat the British, and the French hated the British, so they liked that. They wanted to weaken Britain, and they wanted to regain some of their lost territories in Canada. All right, some contributions of the French to the American cause, mainly Marquis de Lafayette, and went over there and was fighting for the Americans. And the most important thing was the French Navy, which came over to America to help fight the British Navy, because the Americans hardly had a navy at all. And the French Navy would go over and play a pivotal role in the siege of Charleston, which effectively ended the American Revolution. Let's move on to the war in the South. Okay, so the South was a little bit more loyalist. They were more okay, like pound for pound. They were a little bit more okay being with the British, and they were less big on independence. But George Washington deployed this absolute dog, Nathaniel Greene, to the South, and he started smoking up all the British. General Morgan, another American, decisively defeated the British at the Battle of Cowpens. Another British army obliterated. And despite the British control, the British took some control there early on, but then the Americans came back and destroyed them all, and then decisively defeated the Southern British Army at the Battle of Charleston. War in the West. The whole war was on the East Coast, so I don't know what that is. I agree with that statement. And I don't know. I guess they were fighting Native Americans. If they ask you about the American Revolutionary War happening in the West, just show Mrs. Clark and be like, this is dumb. Benedict Arnold. Okay, so Benedict Arnold is a very interesting character. He was an American, and he fought in a bunch of battles, and every time he fought in a battle, he won, except he got all of his credit stolen from him by a different person who was there. Fort Ticonderoga. He took Fort Ticonderoga, but all of the credit was stolen from him by this guy named Ethan whatever. And then at the Battle of Saratoga, he won the Battle of Saratoga with this brilliant bayonet charge or cavalry charge or something. And then all of the credit was taken from him by another guy. And basically he got fed up with this, all of his glory getting stolen. So he switched sides from the Americans to the British, and then became a British person and started fighting the Americans. And this was a huge blow to American morale. And he handed over the fort of West Point during his betrayal, so that was another strategic blow. It was bad, but it doesn't matter because Marquis de Lafayette's in the building, and he was a dog. He was a French general, and he supported Washington's forces, and he was big in the siege of Yorktown. Very important. His contributions were pivotal in the American victory. He helped bring the French army over to support. Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. This was actually, I said Charleston was the end. This is the real end of the American Revolution. George Washington traps George Cornwallis in Yorktown, and with American French troops all around and French Navy blockading the harbor, there's no escape, and so George Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington, and everyone, that's it. Everyone can't believe what just happened. This ragtag army of militiamen just upset the greatest power the world knows. And this was the biggest British army under George Cornwallis, and after they surrendered, the British basically had nothing left. So that was the biggest dub for the Americans, and just love to see it. Establishment of America, hoorah rah. All right, let's finish out chapter 5 with the Treaty of Paris. This was what ended the war. American diplomats John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, they had big diplomatic victories, secured American independence, established borders between modern-day Canada and the United States of America and Florida, and this ensured the British withdrawal from all American territories. This was what solidified America becoming its own country. Spanish interests. Spain focused on regaining control of Florida, which had lost to Britain in the 7 Years' War. While Spain did not directly participate in the treaty, its interests influenced the broader negotiations, whatever that means. The French were basically just driven by their hatred of the British. Anything to get back at Britain, they would do, so that's why they were fighting in this war. And after the Treaty of Paris, they they didn't really get anything except prestige and bragging rights. So that's cool. And then like 20 years later, the French Revolution happens and King Louis dies, R.I.P. And provisions of the treaty officially ended the American Revolutionary War, recognized American independence, established U.S. borders, granted fishing rights off Canada. The treaty also addressed the restoration of loyalist property and confirmed British withdrawal from American territory, making the U.S. as the first independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. That's us. We're the best. Everyone was just hopping on the trend afterwards. You know, you see like Brazil, Mexico, yada, yada, yada. They're all fans. Evidence of movement towards equality. The revolution stimulated discussions on equality, though practical changes were limited. It was super influenced by the Enlightenment and other thought movements that were going on at the time. A lot of equality going around. You see the Enlightenment a lot in the Declaration of Independence. Egalitarianism, which just means the thought that all people are equal. It raised ideas of egalitarianism, but progress was slow. Suffrage for women and black people was basic. Voting for women and black people was not a thing for a while. Here we go. Exclusion of African Americans and women. Despite the push for equality, African Americans and women remained largely excluded and oppressed, with slavery and gender roles unchanged, and political reforms primarily benefiting white landowning men. That's the way it goes. Republican motherhood. This is like Republican motherhood. So we'll get to Republican motherhood when we get there. Religious toleration as a result of the revolution. Okay. Bill for establishing religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson eliminated religious tests for voting and office holding, meaning you didn't have to pass Christian tests to run for office. Ended government funding for churches, separation of church and state, barred state imposed religious beliefs, meaning the state can't impose religious beliefs onto you. Clear separation of church and state. Allowed for religious diversity, that's in the First Amendment. Christian republicanism. This merged religious and secular ideas, emphasizing the virtue and moral restraint. Were vital for a free society, meaning basically looking at what the Puritans did and were like, let's not do that. They were like, we agree with Christian values, but we can't make that the center point of our society, otherwise it will fail. That was a thing. It emphasized the religious and political freedom were necessary for progress. Economy changes resulting from the revolution. Severe inflation happened after America became independent. In fact, America almost collapsed right after it became independent because of how much it hurt the economy. They spent so much money on the war that they were kind of super broke. But even after prices soared in public outrage, because the British were no longer forcing them to only trade with the British, they could sell their goods at a fair price, and this allowed money to slowly start coming. There it is, free trade. Post-revolution, free trade gained support over price controls, meaning they could sell the goods that they were making for a far greater price than what they were selling to the British, making them a lot more money. Inspired Adam Smith, father of capitalism. So we started capitalism because we're the bomb. We're just the best. Wealth of Nations. Okay, so Adam Smith, published in 1776, argued that the economic self-interest in the invisible hand of the free market regulates prices more effectively. Capitalism. Than government intervention. Basically saying, don't set fixed prices, let the market do what it wants, and it will make the prices right, which is very valid, correct idea. Next we got the loyalists / the Tories. Here we go. Loyalists were Americans who supported the British Crown during the Revolution, not just that they favored being a part of Britain, but they were actively fighting for the British. They faced big property loss and humiliation, all the independence, all the people who were fighting for independence. They basically shunned these people out of society. Many of them had to go back to England after the war because they just couldn't live in America. Which groups remain loyal and why? Okay, groups that remain loyal were wealthy merchants and officials who depended on the navigation acts to make them a bunch of money. Ethnic minorities like the Highland Scots who feared like majority rule. Same thing with like Catholics and like other religious minorities who were kind of scared of the Protestant majority ruling over them. But that turned out to not be that big of a deal. Elite landowners who were making a bunch of bag selling their stuff to the British, and enslaved people hoping for freedom in a British victory because they were fighting for them. Geographic distribution of the Loyalists. Loyalists were numerous in New York, Pennsylvania, and the back countries of the South, like the Carolinas and the Georgias, where all the big land estates were, and north, where the initial settlements were. Now we're on to Joseph Brant. He was a Mohawk leader who was trying to create an Indian confederacy between Canada and the new United States, like a little everybody's happy. They gave up. It didn't happen, but it was an idea. In the Treaty of Paris, America was granted sovereignty over lands, included those occupied by the Native Americans, so this kind of helped American expansion. Another thing for Joseph Brant. Abolition. So abolition is just the getting rid of slavery. Abolition was hindered by slavery's deep roots in America. Thomas Jefferson says that he was going to put the abolition, like the freedom of all slaves, in the Declaration of Independence. But the reason why they didn't do that was to ensure the support of the South. If they had gotten rid of slaves, then the South, like Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, would not have joined them in the American Revolution, and they surely would have lost. So even though it's frowned upon today, it was a strategic decision, and if he had chose to put the abolishment of slaves in the Declaration of Independence, America likely would have lost the Revolutionary War. Freedom petitions. These were arguments presented by enslaved African Americans to New England courts and legislatures demanding liberty, being like, hey, the Enlightenment also like means us too, right? Lemuel Haynes, he was a black member of the Massachusetts militia and a late minister, argued in 1776 that if liberty was truly a universal principle, then African Americans deserved the same rights as Englishmen. Free black communities. The revolution led to the creation of free black communities in the North with their own churches, schools, and leaders. By 1810 or so, the free black population had grown to nearly 200,000. These are black African Americans who are not enslaved in the North. These communities challenged the long-standing tradition of slavery and became a base for further abolition efforts. One of the effects of the American Revolution was the Haitian Revolution that saw the American Revolution and was like, I can do that. And so they began an uprising against the French, and it worked. So all you have to know is that the Haitian Revolution was inspired by the American Revolution. Okay, now we have the role of women. Women didn't really do much in the American Revolution. I'm going to keep it a buck, except for or maybe that was the Civil War. The lady with the cannon. Oh no, that Deborah Sampson. I think she is the lady with the cannon. Women. This is the College Board trying to be inclusive. I love women, but they didn't really do that much. Remember the ladies. This is John Adams' wife writing him a private letter saying to remember the ladies when he created new laws. John Adams most certainly did not remember the ladies when creating the new laws. Deborah Sampson. This lady's this person. This is a woman. This is a real woman right here. She disguised herself as a man to enlist in the Continental Army. She fought in battles and received an honorable discharge. That's a true patriot. That's a dog right there. Coverture. This was a legal principle inherited from Britain that remained intact after American independence. It said that a husband had legal authority over his wife. Property decisions, anything, man was in charge of the family. Finally, we get to Republican motherhood. This was an ideology that emerged after the Revolution, emphasizing women's crucial role in educating their children, basically like a trad wife, uphold traditional Republican values and morality. It promoted expanded educational opportunities for women so they could give political wisdom to future citizens, basically emphasizing women's roles as teachers of the next generation, despite excluding them from direct political involvement. And we've done it. The greatest thing to ever happen in all of history. The creation of the greatest nation to ever exist in all of history. The United States of America. All empires fall, but not this empire, because we're the bomb. We destroyed the greatest nation that the world had ever seen. Well, actually, no. We destroyed the greatest power of the time, Great Britain, as a little ragtag squad of militiamen. We showed true courage and bravery. America nowadays might not be a shadow of its former self, you could say, politically and socially, not militarily, but it's kind of inspiring sometimes to look back and look at these absolute dogs who fought for freedom, for white men, and greater economic opportunity. So thanks for watching this whole video. Hope this helps you guys study a lot. And as always, full completed learning targets linked in the description with a full-length practice test. Go get some hundreds and tell Mrs. Cluck I say hi. Adios. Adios.